welcome to Coming Home, Survive and Thrive in Homeschooling. I am Christine, and today Anne Pinkava joins me to share her experience as a homeschooled teen. We chat about good books, the advantages of homeschooling, good education and prospects without going to university, and hints for students and parents to aim for the best homeschool years for their families. Hello, Anne, and thank you so much for agreeing to come on and talk to us about life as a homeschool child and teen. I am actually assuming there that you're a long-term homeschooler. Perhaps I shouldn't assume. How long were you homeschooled for?
Well, first off, thanks for having me. It's fun.
Pleasure.
But also, I probably wasn't what you'd consider to be a long school homeschool or a long-term homeschooler, because I was actually public schooled until I think it was eighth grade was both my brother and I. Yes, he's younger than me. We were both taken out of school to be homeschooled for what would have been my eighth grade year. And then we went back to a smaller public school, him for the rest of his schooling career, and me just for a semester. And then I went back to homeschooling for the rest of high school.
So the rest of high school, sorry, is what?
Right.
What age?
Sorry, that would oh man, now I gotta do math. But that would be let's see, that'd be 14 through 18.
Okay.
Oh.
Right. Did you go on to uni or college, I think you call it?
Oh no, I didn't. So
good, that's another subject altogether, isn't it?
I know that whole lack of debt thing is pretty fantastic.
And look, when I listen to you talking and writing, I realize what a depth of education and knowledge you have actually got. You can express yourself so well.
Well, it's very kind of you.
Well, it's noticeable, which leads me on to thinking, what differences do you see in yourself and your peers once you are out in the adult world?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. When this kind of goes back to why I personally decided to re-homeschool after, again, homeschooling for only the eighth grade, and then, like I said, back to public school for a semester and coming back. And it's something I, kind of took harder as a child than you would as an adult, that you're kind of, in the hormonal teenage stage, but that I was very different from my peers, that my range of interests were like very strange. I remember, for one thing, my parents always loved to read and encouraged reading, and I love like literature from the 1800s, and that's why I would read when I was that age, middle school and high school. And I'd sit there and I remember that I had a Jane Eyre confiscated from me in class once, and I was really mad. But that was, that I love these kinds of books, and that was something very rare for any of my peers to kind of like interact with. Like some of them would read more classics, but it was not a common thing. There was one time, again, for that semester after I went back from homeschooling, where it was a Spanish class, and it was this fun little quiz thing where they had Latin root words, and we weren't one of the homeschooling families that did Latin. So that's, neither here nor there. But because I had read different books and I had a wider vocabulary, I was, I don't think the quiz was even for credits. So I'm like, oh, this is easy. That it's like, oh, well, I know these words. I know, therefore I can extrapolate what the Latin root words are. And everyone else was kind of struggling, and I felt bad. Like, oh, you don't, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you tall poppy, you.
I know. I'm like, I'm just gonna go sit in the corner. Okay,
Oh,
sorry. No,
oh.
it's fine though.
So did you say that was was that your pre-homeschooling years, or when you did a little, when you went back
That
in for
was
a little while?
um that was after I had had a year of homeschooling. Though to be fair, I always had kind of this literature interest. So that's not, you can't really, you can blame homeschooling for that insofar as you can blame my parents for that. So,
Blame as in, wow, what a privileged upbringing you had. How
well,
blessed you were. Okay, so fast forward then to now that you are out of any type of formal schooling and you're in the adult world, can
right.
you see across into your peers and go, oh, what are the differences there that you're actually seeing that say could be attributed perhaps to your homeschooling experience?
Um, I'm not sure. It's hard to say because mostly I come, I guess you would say, into educational differences when, talk about different interests and different knowledge on things. But I don't know. I'm not sure well, in my workplace at least, that I'm particularly more up to snuff on the job itself than other people. But yeah, it's I'm not sure. I'm not
Okay,
quite sure, but I'm sorry.
that's quite all right. Can you tell us then what type of curriculum your family, or I guess your parents, chose or you helped influence to use when you were homeschooled?
Oh, sure. Well, we did a couple of different things. We used Saxon math
Mhm.
to begin with. We had a couple of different like boxed curriculums, mostly for things like science. And because I don't know, science was something that I didn't particularly excel at. So it was kind of the box curriculums were very straightforward, very simple. It's like, okay, get your credit. Like, don't worry too much about it. Just do science. We had a book called Learning Language Through Literature for English. And history, that's one I really enjoyed because we didn't have like a set curriculum for that. We had like for a while we did Ken Burns' Civil War documentary. So it was watch a section, every day and then write a little paragraph about it. And there was different history books that my mother would assign. Like I can't remember what they all are, but it was the same sort of concept where it's not a quote school book, but this is a history book about the American Revolution. Again, read a chapter every day, write a paragraph about what you learned, move on. And we did Winston Churchill's History of the English Speaking Peoples, which I never actually finished those, but they were absolutely excellent. Um, that Churchill is very concise, and it's interesting having history from one historical figure than writing about other historical figures.
I have noticed in watching you with other podcasts and some of the things you've mentioned, you have a quite a big interest of things, say, outside of America. You're well versed and knowledgeable about things of England and Great Britain and Europe, and even down here in Australia, New Zealand. I go, oh wow. What do you think has not spurned, that's the wrong word. What led you to have that such a large interest of outside the Americas?
Well, I part of that can be the literature connection because when you grow up and you read Dickens and Jane Austen and Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Bronte and all of those, then you're like, then the connection to England kind of becomes like, oh, well, even that this is a much older book and you have a culture gap with time as well as a culture gap with place, but it's the becoming interested in the different cultures and with that. And also when I was a brand new homeschooler. I mean, I had this sort of interest in England already. And I also watched a lot of British TV. And so I would then uh, look at British news online because I've always been kind of interested in politics. So learning, what's happening with the NHS and with Brexit, and from there it's kind of all Commonwealth countries together, I suppose. That there's more of an interest there. And I did visit New Zealand. Gosh, maybe at least 6 years ago. It may be as long as no, might be seven. I'm not sure. I'd have to draw it up to remember. But yes, I was very impressed with New Zealand. I was surprised that like I was expecting when I went, I was expecting it to be like the food and things like that are more what I would consider English than I expected, and the climate is more tropical than I expected, kind of coming at it, of course, from the Lord of the Rings, thinking that it's going to be very hilly and English countryside, and to some extent it is. But anyways,
Yes, depending on where you go in New Zealand, that is so. So okay. Well, that then naturally gives you that. Every time you must hear New Zealand mentioned or something on the news, your little radar must go down into there because you've just been here and you can relate to it. And Lord
right,
of the Rings did do New Zealand, to be fair.
yeah,
Yeah, suddenly
it
we're
did.
very fashionable and trendy. Yay. Okay, and can you let's talk about what are some of the advantages of being homeschooled, especially like you've already said you were at school, then you were homeschooled. So you actually have some comparison to make. What advantages can you see?
Well, it does give you the freedom to pursue more of your own interests and not to, I don't know, not to uh, that you're not necessarily stuck in what the school program is. And for, like I said, for history, that I was assigned certain books. But if I had said, what I really want to learn about right now is World War II history, and we did learn some World War II history, but if I said, no, I want to specifically learn about Pacific Theater World War II history, then my mom would just be like, yeah, sure, go for it. I mean, do again, write a paragraph, make sure that you're learning things. But yeah, if you want to dive into one direction or another, you have the total freedom to do that.
True. Yeah, that was definitely our experience too. Can you talk about, you've already mentioned some authors that I'm guessing are some of your favorites, and I know that we're going to have some homeschool parents and perhaps even students listening to this too who are going to say, oh, please tell me, what do you recommend? So do us all a favor and give us a shortcut to some of your favorite books.
Okay. Well, like you said, I already mentioned, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell. She's so good. Bronte sisters, though I'm not overly fond of Wuthering Heights. A lot of people are though. So, um, but yes, all of those are excellent. Louisa May Alcott, Lucy Maud Montgomery, of course, are very good. Arthur Conan Doyle. Um, after okay, so after my official homeschooling time, I dove into some Japanese authors, which really, really phenomenal books that from the let's see, I think it's I'm going to pronounce it wrong. I always read it as the Meijing era, but that's not what it's called. But about turn of last century Japan, once it was first opened up to the world, and it was 400 years of Western culture slammed into Japan at once, and that changed the literary scene a lot. And it's really, really interesting to read about. But Natsumi Soseki is one of the premier, quote, modern classics of Japan. Excellent stuff. Osamu Dazai might be he can be a bit intense. Maybe not for your younger teenagers especially. But really, really good stuff. Yeah.
Okay. That's a really helpful,
But,
because within each of those authors is quite a drop down box, depending on the author. So, so I guess what you're actually, I think you might be saying here, Anne, is just choose the author. Don't worry about so much about the book. Just go
oh,
for it.
that's true. And I am very much a person that if I really, really get into something, like I sat down and I read all of the Anne of Green Gables books in order to the end, every single one of them. And I was that way with Sherlock Holmes too. That's like, no, this is a complete edition and I'm going to read them completely. I mean, if I had got bored and wandered away, that's fine. But very much like, no, it's Jane Austen. I'm going to read all six of her major works. I haven't read all of Dickens, I'll admit. They're much longer.
Yes. Have you read any of C.S. Lewis's or Chesterton's fiction?
Oh, yes. Um, Not Chesterton's fiction. I don't know why. It is very difficult to find like any physical copies. I've ordered his book Orthodoxy online, but like I don't again, it I must be much less popular in America, but I find it very difficult to come by that. I know that a lot of them are available for like free online and there's audiobooks and stuff, but no, I really enjoy his the way that he puts things in his theology, but I haven't read any of his fiction.
Chesterton or Lewis?
Chesterton.
Chesterton, okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
He wrote the Father Brown series.
Yes, I've heard that's good. I haven't read it yet though.
Yeah, you can see his same style and orthodoxy coming through naturally into his fiction. He also wrote a book called The Club of Queer Trades.
Okay.
Yeah, which isn't what our modern mind would put into the word queer. It is
Right.
the original one, the Club of Unusual Trades, we'll call it. But that's a brilliant piece of writing too. Okay, well, that's really helpful actually to get some good book recommendations, because I know people are always on the prowl for that. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And what do you think a homeschool parent should do more of or less of?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say. Um and especially since when I was homeschooled, we weren't part of any like homeschool co-op or anything. So my I didn't necessarily run into a lot of my peers homeschooling to compare notes, to see if I liked or disliked what they were doing. I would say that one of the problems I would see in the general homeschooling uh, movement, especially the Christian homeschooling groups, that there seems to be a lot of like little fads that happen, especially like little theological and ideological fads um, that I don't know. A lot of them I don't think are very helpful. That, for example, a few years ago there was Vision Forum, and they were very popular for a while, and it was very um, strict gender roles, very strict dating rules. And again, I am A plus. I am for gender roles, not to knock them at all. But there is a tendency to take any even a good point and take it to its nth degree, and naturally Vision Forum went bust because the founder had had an affair and there was a scandal involved,
Yeah.
as it always happens. But things like that, where even if, yay, this is a group that supports homeschooling and supports what you think are good values, that there still needs to be a level of discernment with that, which, I mean, that's with any sort of group, but that, it's one of the, I love like Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, but I am generally like any sort of Christian self-help book. I mean, the number of them that I've actually enjoyed is like, or thought were useful, is like not enough to count on my fingers. So keeping to, you know, general sensible theologians and stuff that have been tested over time, and not necessarily the new fad book that is out every week, is something that I would say. But
That's actually really good advice. I think let's just move around this just a little bit more, because that's exactly the kind of thing parents are looking for. So you said before, to exercise discernment is to know what type of what seems to be a really, really good help book. If I can kind of illustrate it by going, when you haven't delegated your children's education, mothers especially, because they're the ones doing the bulk of the homeschooling, feel quite vulnerable and highly responsible. So I think they're more susceptible to being pulled in where they have their own doubts to the latest self-help, because you're always kind of looking for the key that's going to just unlock successful homeschooling. But you've already referred to something that's been tested by time. So how would you say, look at Lewis and say Chesterton, what would you advise a homeschool parent to drill down on, say, in their theology, to help them make their decisions about what to take on and what not to?
well, I would even say that looking at, again, for theology, and not necessarily connecting it to education, but as being a part of education if you are a Christian homeschooling parent. I would say that even looking at them, there's things that I disagree with. I mean, for example, Chesterton was Catholic. I'm not Catholic. But I can still look at his stuff and say that, no, this is a good bit of advice. This over here, I'm not going to agree with, because, I'm not praying to the Virgin Mary. That's
Cool.
Chesterton loved Mary. Good for him. But, again, not Catholic. But it's that sort of coming with a level of, I don't know, that even with people that you agree with, or books that you agree with, that not everything is going to be exactly line up with what you believe. And I don't know, I guess from being homeschooled, you're weird anyways, or being Christian, you're weird anyways. And, I said, I'm not Catholic, I'm King James Version Baptist. Okay. I'm used to being weird. So, that coming to think that, I know it's an important thing for homeschooling too, to not just, give your children good stuff, which is of course essential, but also to sort of teach them the difference between good and bad. For example, when I was with my parents, and we still do this, if there's a news bulletin on the radio and it's something stupid, my parents would say that that's stupid, and it would be like live fact checking, and that we would have that sort of thing of, and and this happens, that they would talk about it, what's good or what's bad or what should be, answering questions and things. And it's made us terrible to watch movies with. But that the sort of when your family's together, and when your family's together, that it's enough to kind of model reactions to the world, that that you're sort of, again, even with good books, the being firm enough in what you believe, or being willing to have what you believe questioned enough to come up with good answers, that you need that sort of level in an education too.
That matches in very well with you were saying, even when you're watching a movie, even when you were listening to the live bulletin, I'm seeing quite clearly that in your home you didn't have a start and stop time for education. Really, the whole world, as I often say, is your classroom, and your parents never, well, it's not that they're looking for opportunities, you just learn the habit of it, don't you, that it never actually stops.
Right. And I don't know. Sorry. That yeah, so there is this level of never actually stopping. And there is a level of that you're, you know, like it or not, we all become our parents in the end, and not necessarily in the way we expect. Um, but if you enjoy um music, your kids are going to pick up whatever music you listen to, whether that be, pop, rock, classical, whatever. And if you're putting on classical music for the sake of your kids and you enjoy it, like they're not going, why would they care? You don't care. Why would they pay attention? And having that, that you kind of, if you're around people, you're kind of naturally into their interests. And that, happens in a home too. That if you're like I said before, my parents were always interested in reading, they were interested in politics, they were interested in different things. So naturally, you know, I'm, if I'm around them all the time, they're going to talk about these things. I'm going to ask questions about these things, even as a little kid just looking at the world.
Mm, mm, mm. When you've got your children at home for a set amount of years, there's an endless amount potentially that you could choose to include in their homeschooling. So, looking back over your years at home, is there any kind of particular things or even subjects or even themes or ideas that you would say to parents, you've got this set of time, and once it's over, it's over. Make sure you include this. Don't worry about that so much. Can you think of anything offhand?
Um, I'm not sure because I mean, definitely things like history where like later on in life, of course you can learn about history later on in life, but having this set down time of no, we're actually going to go through and make sure that you don't have any, missing gaps. Which is one of the best parts about having a set school program and not just going off your own interests, because even though I go off my own interests all the time, I find that even then you're missing bits because you're just looking at what you like to do. And while that's great for getting the initiative to go ahead and go forward, um that you do miss, um like I had an example that if you're interested in World War II and the Pacific Theater, that's awesome. Go learn about that. But if that's all you're paying attention to, that maybe you should have paid attention a little bit in Europe and North Africa, and maybe that would have also been an important thing to fill out the entire picture. So having that school time to sort of make sure that, like I said, it's good to go in a direction, but to make sure that you get a fuller picture as well. Um, I know there's like I said that I wasn't very good at science, but there's practical bits of science that I really wish I had learned. I had a friend tell me the other day, and again, this is quite ignorant of me, but she was telling me, and she was another homeschooled friend, or someone who had been homeschooled, and she was telling me on the chemical level why soap works against grease. And I was just sitting there like, why didn't I know this? This is like, oh, I feel really bad now. I had no clue. And there's practical things like that. Different little things about mechanics that I don't know. Um, I I am a big fan of infotainment, which is probably an issue, but like all of the NASA But all of the NASA astronauts, they do little videos that they put out online, and you can sit there and you can watch all the NASA astronauts, and they will tell you and explain, how science works. And there's nothing like space to get kids excited about science. So, things like that, I think would be quite interesting to include.
Make sure you include it. Okay. But then the thing is too, is that you never lose what it is to continue your education, do you? Your education doesn't stop the day you graduate, and
Right.
you just learn something. However, that's a good point to take for some parents, is to look for some very basic everyday things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. And you mentioned in passing before that you didn't go to university.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a decision like that doesn't happen by accident. Do you mind explaining why you didn't go to university?
Oh, sure. Well, my mother was a history major, and I remember distinctly when she said that she had finally paid off her college debt. And she was very adamant saying that this is ridiculous. Like, unless there is something that you really want to go to school for that has a very specific, um, set of schooling that you need, like if you want to be a nurse or a lawyer or something. She said, if you want to be a history major, I really could have just sat home and read the books, but I paid all of this money instead. So
Okay.
that was part of, my decision not to, because, well, I already have the books. Um, but that, I don't know, the mentality of if it's a lot of money to pay to get a piece of paper to say, woohoo, you're all good. Um, when a lot of the education that you could have got, especially for something, I mean, like an English degree or a history degree, can be achieved on your own.
Mm. I feel that that's an important thing to consider, because the mindset is still there that you need to go to university. Otherwise, you won't get the job. You won't have a full education. You won't be the successful person you could be if you don't go to uni. Maybe back in our day, that may have been so. For your generation and younger, not so much, and even more so now.
Right. And I would say too, I mean, how many people, you know, did, did did get the degree, and either they work in an entirely different field than what they got a degree for, which is very common, or have generally the same type of job that can be achieved without a degree too. That it's, I don't know, that it's, you start out your life then, like I said, with a lot of debt, which was something I was very reluctant to do. Um, and I don't know that you're better for it.
Hmm. So some of the arguments for it, say, might be, well, it teaches you discipline. It teaches you how to write well. What else does it teach you? And all of those things can be done in a homeschool situation. So how?
It's true. And I would say for discipline, okay, nothing in this world will teach you discipline like a boss who is very particular about the time clock on a job that you hate. It is such a learning curve knowing that you have to show up and you have to go to that job even though you hate it, and you have to be on time or you're going to get in trouble, is that will teach you a lot right there. Just the ability to stick it out and get the job done anyways.
And it'll teach you for free.
Teach you for money, actually. It's great.
Oh, true, true, true.
Even better.
I think there's a cultural depth, if you like, to the acceptance and assumption that to go on to, well, in New Zealand we call it university. I think you call it college, right? College to us is high school.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's you've read, and especially for like a homeschooling parent, I will admit to the sense of pride and I told you so, because all five of our children went from being homeschooled right through to the end of high school and into university. Woohoo, look at us. Aren't we the successful homeschool parents?
Right. There is a certain amount of validation to that. Yes.
But I think there's going to have to be a whole kind of reset and a cultural mindset. And I am starting to see that actually happen down here, where the older students and the parents are starting to go, why? So,
well, and also, again, talking about history majors in particular, and like, I love history. I'm not saying, that you shouldn't learn about history or whatever else. But I remember talking to two different people who went to our local college or university. I guess it is technically a university, like it has that in the title. But they were talking about different classes that they had for history classes. And I'm like, oh, cool. What are you learning about? And I'm like, get a little learning on the side for free. And one of them had said that they had a class. I believe it was about the ancient world, and it was about some war strategy was a part of the class that she was taking. And I'm sitting there like, whoa, how cool. And then she said that the assignment was to play this war strategizing video game. And I'm like, what? I mean, if the game is set up well, there might be some value in that, but how many thousands of dollars are you paying to be told to play a video game that you could be you could have just run into that video game for fun and started playing it. And another different person had said that their college professor had told them to read Game of Thrones because, that's very much like a lot of history. And I'm like, shouldn't you be reading the history? If you're like, oh, well, there's a lot of drama and intrigue in history. That's great. Why aren't we learning about that?
read
I
the
was
real
just
history.
the real history. I'm like, that sounds actually exciting, what actually happened, as opposed to the poor, novelization fantasy world mock-up.
So here's a message for homeschool parents watching this and some older students also. They've heard you just discuss why you didn't go to university, and it wasn't because you were too thick. You are a bright young woman. You are articulate. And so everything you've just done is an advertisement for how they too can go on into life without feeling obligated or the necessity to go to university. Thank you for that community service, Anne, of showing this also can be you.
Yeah, well, I would also say, and if there's plenty of things too that very specifically, if you want a career in a specific field, like I get it. If you want a specific certification or something like that, sure. But just not only that, you don't need to go to college, but that if you want to learn a specific thing, or like I said, get specific certification, that it's not necessarily like, don't think that college is the only option for that, or that a certain kind of college is the only option for that. That, you can be more creative with your options.
Thank you. I feel that was a really important message that we've stumbled on really into this interview, because it wasn't on my list of questions. Thank you. Moving on from that slightly, Anne, I met you via a knitting group, and I started to watch a podcast that you co-host called Politically Incorrect Knitters. Can you please explain, go back, the how and the when, and if your homeschooling experience and the result of the woman that it created, if you like, how on earth did you end up doing that? And can you flick it back to anything to do with homeschooling?
Sure. Well, as you say, Politically Incorrect Knitters, it is a show with politics and knitting. And it started in 2020. That end of May 2020, which is a very exciting time in the world in the middle of lockdowns, and George Floyd riots were happening just then. And we start our podcast about knitting because on this is story that I'm sure many people in the knitting world may know. But in 2019, Ravelry had banned all Trump supporters off their platform, saying that any support for the president was de facto white supremacy, which was rather shocking since, half of the country voted for the president. So that's painting with quite a broad brush. But yes, it was. I'm still surprised they haven't got sued for that, because that is such a level of discrimination. But all that to the side, part of why I started specifically, and it was me and my co-host, who is known as Deplorable Knitter, and we, connected through Instagram originally, but I have always had this interest in news and world events. So for me, this sort of microcosm of the knitting world, that immediately I took that as a reflection of the bigger picture of what's happening in politics and what's happening with different people being canceled and things like that, and sort of the very ideological angle that hobbies took. And I know that's happened in other community groups too, like gaming groups, and you see it all the time in TV and in sports and the rest of it. And my first pattern came out. I was actually listening to Rush Limbaugh, who is a political commentator in America, or was. He died, unfortunately. But he was talking about Colin Kaepernick and how he refused to wear Betsy Ross branded Nikes, because that was supposed to be a promotion of slavery. Betsy Ross, who was a Quaker and an abolitionist, and not to mention that those Nikes are made in China by slave kids. Like, there's so much wrong with this statement, but that the original American flag is somehow de facto slavery. And anyways, that was my first pattern. So having that, and Deplorable Knitter was known for her Trump pattern. So having that level of political interest and bringing that into knitting, and to have that political interest kind of cultivated, like in homeschooling. Like I said, my parents were very politically interested, but also just with the simple fact of, because I wasn't in school all day, there was Rush Limbaugh on the radio, that we were listening to other things throughout the day. And even if it's just background noise, it's always there. So yeah, I very up to date on current events, and I'm in the habit of being up to date on current events, even though now I have to tell myself, no, wait, I gotta stop down and actually write down the number or the statistic if I'm going to talk about it later. But that does get a little old, but necessary. But yeah, that definitely, and different historical context things too definitely help. That kind of being given that time, and I guess not focus energy, but if I was homeschooled, would I necessarily know about what happened with Reagan and Buckley through the 80s? Maybe, not very likely. Different sort of conservative touchstone people and issues that is useful to remember when you have a show about politics. And also too, I've been knitting since I was a teenager, so extra time for that as well. All for my exciting knitting podcast career.
One of the things I noticed about you fairly early on, and even before I realized that you were a homeschool girl, was that you have this level of courage about you that, in spite of the risk of what the mobs can do, and we just keep seeing that like over and over and over, you just did it anyway. It was like it mattered to you more than what might actually happen to you. And I recognize that in myself as something that I did not have so much. And I admired that. And I know that that must be part of your innate character. But I also wonder if part of your homeschooling experience didn't allow you to be who you naturally were more than what might happen if you had gone to a public school. Have you got any comment around that?
Um, well, well, thanks for thinking I'm brave. I'm not sure I am really. And I will say that I haven't got a level of backlash that a lot of other people have. So I mean, there's several different people and people that we've interviewed who, for example, they've had established knitting businesses, and there have been sort of online hate mobs that have gone against them, against anyone who buys from them. Okay, that is because that's not how I had a business. That is not something I've experienced. And there hasn't been, I mean, sure, there's people who don't like our podcast, but since we kind of came out as a conservative podcast right away, there wasn't that big turn and, kind of bite at us sort of thing that, like, sure, people say rude stuff online, but like I said, they hasn't been like, I haven't had a business to destroy, or I haven't, I in the case of Sockmatician, where he had, close personal friends that he worked with who then publicly betrayed him and privately said, oh, but I'm kind of for you, which is awful. But no, I haven't experienced that, and I won't pretend to experience or have experienced anything as close to that. But and also and again, this is not necessarily a good thing about my character, but when I'm sort of in between a decision, like some decisions, I'll sit there and I'll hem and haw forever whether or not I should do. But when it's something like this, like, oh, I'm not sure, like when we were it was a while before we actually started our podcast. It was a couple months before it actually happened until we finally said, all right, sure, we're doing it. But I'm kind of the person, it's like the cat with the glass on the side of the table, where sometimes I'm like, I'm not sure, maybe bad things will happen, and then I'll just push it off. So it's like, well, the glass already hit the floor, so there's no going back now. That, oh, well, I'm already out there. Well, it's like, okay, well, maybe I should. No, I'm just gonna say it. No, it's too much time. It's too much mental thought on my part to not say it. So I might as well just come out. And that part of the thing too with having my name out there, there's a lot of people, which I totally respect, that they don't want their real name out on the internet. But it's kind of, for me, like my entire online presence before had my name on it. I'm like, well, I can't really scrub it. I mean, I could pretend to scrub it. I could go back. I could try to hide things, but also it's just so much to think of. like, no, it's just me. I'm me, straightforward. That's fine. I'm not very good when it comes to little pseudonyms and online names. Might as well just walk out there with my real name, smile, and then move on from there.
So that this, even though you haven't had some of the drama around some, I know you have had some because I've seen it. There's still a sense of, well, you're prepared to do it. You're willing to take that risk. And you
Right.
mentioned a little bit before that, oh, I'm weird, and it just kind of just. I don't think you are. I think that if everybody was just allowed to be who they actually are, what their character is, and I get a sense, because I love to just watch and assess people and just think about what they're doing. And when I see a lot of homeschoolers and I see a lot of public school, that one of the things that I notice is that it's more likely that a homeschooled student will be more confident about who they are and not worry so much about peer pressure. It's never completely gone. I get that. Whereas over here, generally speaking, in a public school scenario, decisions are more likely to be made due to what your peers may or may not think of you. Now I realize there are extremes at both ends where that just doesn't count, but that has been my observation over 20 plus years since we started the whole homeschooling thing. Was
Right.
one of the things that why we wanted to just keep going, because we were observing our children were more likely to say what they wanted to say, even though they might make some mistakes, and retain who they actually are. So I don't
Right.
see you as weird. I see you as normal, fabulously weird, like we all should be.
Well, I've found that both in sort of now when I interact with people, sort of sort of conservatives in the knitting world, or people who are against, cancel culture in different ways, or even with the lockdowns and people kind of standing up to, different COVID regimes and things like that, that it was very commonly people, that there was former homeschoolers, there were people from different religious groups, but it seemed it was was a lot of people who, for whatever various reason, had kind of, like I say, in being weird, that they have already kind of took the hit and were different. Like that they're, that just like, okay, well, I'm already different here. What's more peer pressure? Um, and yes, what you were saying a bit about the homeschool, the homeschoolers already being very straightforward and okay, this is what I think and this is what I believe. I ran into that. I worked at a Christian camp for several years, and my closest friend there was also homeschooled. And even in that sort of setting, and I would recommend it. It was a good time, probably for unintentional reasons. I'm not sure the camp um, uh, would necessarily endorse, not that it's an unchristian message, but what we took from that experience. um but it was that even in group settings like that, it was realizing the sort of differences between people, and also that some people, like, for why you believe this, or why do you do this, or what's your unpopular opinion on this issue, that'd be like, well, this is what I think. Like, well, well, I've never heard that before. I'm like, oh, well, okay. But it's good. It's good to I don't know, interact with people with a variety of opinions. And it's interesting, like I said, through the political drama of the in America, the Trump drama in particular. It makes me think of this lady I've worked with who would just say, "Oh, Trump and all of his supporters are X," and it didn't seem to cross her mind that that she might be talking to somebody who held a different opinion than she did on that issue, and she didn't necessarily hold to that view. And I think that's helpful too, as someone who's homeschooled, that you don't assume that everybody agrees with you, because you're kind of on the edge of things. And um not to necessarily assume that everyone is wrong either, but you don't come into that with, oh hell, we all believe this, right, guys? And even among homeschoolers, being, it's like herding cats, highly individual too. So even among homeschoolers, be like, well, I think this, and then other homeschoolers would be like, yeah, I don't though. And you can argue it out. I don't know. I think that's healthy. A little difficult at times, but healthy.
Yes, yes. When you were thinking about what we might talk about in the interview, is there anything else that popped up and you thought, oh, that might be interesting to talk about? Anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to say?
Um, I'm not sure. Um, I was thinking about this interview. I'm like, oh well, this or that, and I just remembered it was a joke I made once. but how it's like, okay, so my education is a certain way. I really wish I had the education of like an 1800s ship captain, which is a really random thing to say, but I'm like, why didn't anybody it was like, why didn't I sit down and figure out how to navigate by the stars? That would have been really helpful. The coast winds and the rest of it. Wow. And like, even though I live in the center of the country, as far away from the ocean as you can get, it's like, that would have been really cool. Huh. And then moved on with my life. That I don't know. Even now I'm looking for niche interests.
You can. You absolutely can still go. But, for goodness sake, Anne, a sea captain. Why? Why a sea captain?
Well, think of all the things that you need to learn to be a sea captain. Not only the trade winds and navigating by the stars, but you also need to be a gentleman of knowledge, of world history events, of you know, that you need to be entertaining in company. So singing and playing an instrument and dancing is also important if you're a gentleman. This it's a lot of different things. I don't know.
And within that, you've virtually got an entire curriculum.
Yes. And not to go off on the Japanese again, but I love the Japanese, so I will. There's this saying in Japan that says that the arts are the fingers and art is the palm. So again, in traditional Japanese mentality, that you don't just, you know, have an you're not just good at poetry, you're not just good at dancing, you're not just good at sword play, that you need to have at least a small strength in all of them if you want to completely sort of grasp the arts.
So with the palm is the arts in general, and each of the fingers represent parts
Right.
of. Right, yeah.
Right. So art itself is the palm, the arts are the fingers. That
Again, that's a really helpful way for mums to think about if you're going to teach science. I wasn't
right.
that quite but science either. I love biology, but not science. So if you want to do science, which of all of the smaller details are going to make the whole of science?
Right.
Yeah.
And again, you're not going to be strongest in everything with your smaller fingers, but at least if you can get some of them strong and grasp that, that helps you much more. And then, I mean, you still have your smaller fingers, even though you're not strong in them. So at least having some knowledge, some understanding on things that you are weaker in is helpful as a whole.
Yeah, really helpful. You can find metaphors like that all through life, really, can't you? If you just stop and look. Yeah.
Right.
I know that you're a fellow Mark Stein fan, Anne.
Oh, I love him. That's an education in itself. Just go to his website, listen to his songs of the week, read his stuff. That is enough, kids.
But he does a lot of audio books as well, doesn't he? And
Oh, yes.
yeah, he's a good man. We were introduced to him through our eldest son, and regularly go back and see what Mark Stein is up to.
Mhm.
Anne, with your experience of homeschooling life, let's bring it in a little bit now. And you had the opportunity to talk to a young child. I know you weren't homeschooled when you were a young child, but is there anything, what advice would you offer to a young, let's say, 8-year-old girl who was just literally sitting at your knees, if you like, and saying, tell me what to do?
Well, I would say, I don't know, this probably sounds like fussy old lady advice, but fussy old lady advice is the best. That it is never too young to form good habits, whether it's cleanliness or good handwriting or good spelling. My spelling is, thank goodness for spell check, but having it for real is much better. Things like talking to strangers well is helpful, of being polite, of writing thank you notes. As Lemony Snicket says, it doesn't matter what you do in life. You can go off and you can sell drugs later, but you will always be remembered as the child who wrote good thank you notes if you remember to write good thank you notes when you're given gifts. It's invaluable. But little kind of old-fashioned etiquette book things, which again might seem silly, but they really are important. And also, don't be afraid to try new things, to go out and, even if you don't succeed at first, keep with it for a little bit, but don't be afraid to try new things and see what comes of it.
Right. Thank you. All right. So go forward a few years. Let's say you've got a 15-year-old homeschooling student girl sitting with you, looking for a bit of mentoring, bit of advice, maybe a little bit of a kick in the shins. What would you advise her?
Well, kind of, I don't know, don't on one hand, don't be afraid to try new things. On the other hand, don't be afraid to deep dive into anything or think that any specific project or specific goal is too big, because, little by little we achieve anything. So don't be like, well, I'd like to do that, but don't worry about it. Starting, there's nothing like starting for getting something done. So, if you do have a big goal, don't be afraid to go for it. But also, I'd say in, I don't know, when I was a teenage girl, which I said a little bit about Christian theology books or dating books and everything. I read so many Christian dating books and blog posts and everything else, and they were all rubbish. Don't listen to them. They were bad. Anything, whatever you do, don't make it weird. And anything is like, yes, you want to conduct yourself in a good and generally moral way, but that just to anything that breaks people up instead of brings them together, avoid that. If you're reading, if you want to be able to interact well with your peers, both male and female, don't be so afraid to talk to anybody, and obviously don't go the other way and be a little don't be a floozy on one end, but that you're homeschooled. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about you meeting boys. Do that. Go be happy. But anyways, that's what I would say to myself, which is perhaps not the best advice for everybody. But I don't know. Just remember that all the other awkward teenagers are awkward teenagers too.
It's exactly the kind of thing I'm hoping you're saying. I want you to be able to talk to those kids. Thank you for that, Anne. I can't think of anything else to ask you about homeschooling. Well, I get the sense we could probably go on talking for hours, but let's not. But I am incredibly grateful for your experience. You've so generously offered, and your wise advice, the articulate phrasing that is a result of your education that you've been able to use to describe what you need to say. It really matters. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, total pleasure, Anne. I'll see you on the groups.
All right. See you then.